Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie paper and ink, and I couldn't resist making another card for last week's color throwdown challenge. Those that saw my previous video, I'll have it linked at the end of this one. I was actually on time last week, but I really liked the color combo and I wanted to create another card using it. So I've pulled out the Simon Says Stamp Even More Spring Flowers stamp set. And I have this little Prima watercolor paper block. I've had this for years and I've used it a couple times, but I always kind of forget because it's small and it kind of just gets overlooked in my pile, in my stash of watercolor paper. This little block, it's like 3.5 inches by roughly 6 inches. And if you've never used a watercolor block before, it just means that 2, sometimes 3 of the sides are sealed like a pad of paper. It's that same sort of resin material, so it holds everything in place so that you just stamp on it, or most people, like, you just watercolor on it. Now, I've used this, like I said, I've used it before. I find their watercolor paper, the Prima brand anyway, it's just different. It's not easy to just stamp with ink and then watercolor, like a permanent ink. The water, it'll just wick out. It's hard to explain. I'll have to do a video comparison and show that. But I find if I stamp images like I am now and heat emboss them, it works perfectly fine. So that's what I did. I used my anti-static powder tool and then I stamped the images with Simon's clear embossing ink and then coated them all with Simon's white detail embossing powder and then melted it all. And didn't have a problem doing that with the block. I just made sure not to let my heat tool really sit on those ends there where everything's kind of sealed, because I kind of assumed the heat tool would melt those pieces. And then with everything as it is, I'm just going to very easily watercolor these in using a couple of distress inks that I smushed onto my glass media mat. And then I'm just picking up the color with my little Tim Holtz water brush. Now, those that don't like using water brushes, you can easily just use a paintbrush dipped in water. I always reach for this little water brush. This is a little Tim Holtz one and I always link to it when I use it. And for me, it's just a convenience thing. I always keep a little piece of either cloth or paper towel. It's always off screen, but I always keep that on hand to wipe my brush between colors and to also wipe it if I find that there's too much water. I know that's usually the biggest complaint with water brushes is controlling the water. I find with this one though, I don't have that problem. I don't squeeze it. That's usually my issue with this one, is it actually doesn't dispense water as much as I would like. So when I do squeeze it, too much water comes out. That's when I'll dab off that excess water and then go on and do my thing. So I painted all these with the mustard seed distress ink. And then I'm just adding a second layer by using a little bit less water, more ink, to add those little darker bits that always gives it that extra definition, and it just, you know, makes the color more intense, especially when I'm adding color with white heat embossed images. Adding a second layer helps that heat embossing, the white, kind of show up a little bit more. So I did 3 of these flowers with just that one yellow distress ink. And then after I finished that, I just smushed a tiny little bit of gathered twigs distress ink onto my mat and picked that up and quickly painted that on to finish the centers. After I did the centers, I'm going to do the leaves that I had stamped along the bottom, and I used MOWED lawn distress ink for those and did the exact same thing. Just went in, painted on the color for the first layer, and then everything was still wet, and I'm just dabbing on more intense color with that little less bit of water, just to add that little bit of definition and whatnot. So after I had done that, I let everything dry, which didn't take very long because these are kind of small images. And then to separate this from the block, I carefully, as carefully as possible, I did end up cutting my hand doing this because I was an idiot. You insert scissors or craft knife between the layers of paper and just cut that, and then you can just peel off the resin that's holding the paper in place. So I did that with the first sheet, and then I did the exact same thing with the second sheet, and this leaf image there, just watercolored that. And after everything was dry, I decided to cut everything apart and do all my die cutting with my little Sidekick machine, because I have multiples of the same image. So I'm gonna have to run everything through basically 3 times. So that's where I love my little Sidekick machine. When I got it, I do honestly think that at the time I was like, this is so extra. Like, I have how many die cutting machines? Do I really need a little one too? But I use this one all the time. I love it for things like this when I'm doing multiple die cuts or die cutting, you know, several layers for a small sentiment, etc. It's just faster to run it through my little Sidekick machine. So I'm just taping all the dies, the coordinating dies into place with some washi tape. And then I'm going to pull up my little Sidekick. And that's another benefit of the glass media mat is the Sidekick suctions to this a lot better. I've had emails and comments about that. People have had difficulty with the little suction. Honestly, it doesn't bother me because more often than not, I'll just hold it in place with my hand. I don't care if the suction works. But the little suction mechanism on the glass mat works like fabulous because it's glass, so it just holds this little machine in place no problem. So that's just another benefit for both, just FYI. So I kept running everything through my little machine here so that I got all of these flowers and leaves and leaf clusters die cut. And you can see my cutting plate for this is I flip them over. I use them regularly. I flip them over to keep anything from warping. But yeah, it's really cut into. I've actually purchased a second set of cutting plates for this because I literally use it so often. So after I had everything die cut, I went on and I had die cut a larger piece of pattern paper that I had to use my Gemini Junior for. So I have some green pinstripe paper that I die cut with the largest of the Simon basic rectangle dies. And then I also die cut some Bristol smooth cardstock with one of the Simon WONKY rectangle dies. And after I die cut it, I'm going to use 2 more distressings here. I'm going to use tumbled glass and then broken china distressings. And my original plan was to have my card vertical. So I was starting my sponging from the lower right because that part was going to be covered by the flowers in my head anyway. So that's why I started there. Still kept the sponging really, really light. I just wanted, you know, that nice soft background. So I started with the tumbled glass and then I added that broken china just to deepen it a bit. And then I smushed my broken china ink onto an acrylic block and then just added a few drops of water to that. And then once I had the water in there, I just grabbed a regular paintbrush, mixed that together. So I've got a nice bit of, you know, some blue tinted water here and then splattered that onto my background and very liberally splattered because I have to use it all up. That's just, you know, the way I am. So splattered everything, let it completely dry, and then realized that the sentiment I wanted to use, this is the Happy Mother's Day sentiment from the Best Mom Ever stamp set. This set came out, I think it was last year or the year before. It's been out for a while anyway. So I inked that up with VersaFine Onyx Black and realized it looks better in this orientation. Otherwise it went completely across the other way. So I stamped that with the VersaFine Onyx Black, and then I'm going to adhere that panel with foam tape to my pattern paper. And then I started laying out all these flowers and leaves and trying to figure out how I wanted to arrange this cluster of everything. And my first initial idea was to just arrange everything, take a picture of it, and then take it all off and, you know, re-adhere it into place the way I wanted to. But I decided rather than just take a picture of it to pull out my press and seal wrap, which I've shown this little technique in many videos. And the funny thing is this is the same press and seal wrap I showed in the last video, which I'll link at the end of this one. I just keep using the same piece over and over. I just keep it stored with the container of press and seal and keep it from, you know, collecting any dust or anything. And I just use that same piece over and over. I've been using the same piece for months. So I decided officially on where I want to place everything here. So I got my little leaves kind of tucked in, made sure nothing was really hanging over the edge because I didn't want to have to cut anything off because, like I said, that pattern paper is A2 size. So it's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And then once I was happy with that, I'm going to place the press and seal over it and then press down really well on those flowers and leaves so that it's going to, you know, cling to it and hold everything in place. And then to make the adhering of everything easier, I actually just added 2 strips of foam tape to the main panel here. And then I'm just going to flip over that press and seal and press those into place. So holding it, I'm able to see through it, get my placement right, press that into the foam tape, and then the few little leaves there that weren't going to stick to the foam tape, obviously, I'm going to adhere those with some of the Simon Says Stamp Craft Tacky Glue. And I also ended up squirting the glue under the flowers in a couple spots just because those weren't as adhered to the foam tape because of the little leaf clusters under them. So I just added dabs of the adhesive behind the leaves and then would just tuck those in where I wanted them to go. So after getting those adhered into place, I then squeezed that little bit under one of the flowers, and then I think I went back later and squeezed in a bit more just to make sure everything was held into place properly. So got those last little leaves tucked into place. So then once I have that, I can let that dry, and I'm going to finish off the inside of the card. So my card base is heavyweight white cardstock cut to 5.5 by 8.5, and I scored it at 4 1/4, so it's a top folding A2 size card. And I adhered a strip of that same pattern paper to the inside of the card. And then I inked up the same flower stamp with that mustard seed distress ink and just stamped that. And then made a very quick mask because I wanted to stamp the leaf cluster as well. So I just stamped that image onto a little piece of Post-it paper and then quickly trimmed off just the lower kind of right side of this flower. There was no need to cut out an entire mask for it. I just wanted that lower portion of it to be masked off so I could ink up this little leaf cluster with that MOWED lawn ink and then stamp that. So let that mask kind of sit there to cover the flower, stamp the leaves, remove my mask, everything looks good, and then I'm going to ink up another sentiment from that Best Mom Ever stamp set. So I've got that on my acrylic block. I inked that up with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I'm going to stamp that right over the flower there, and that's going to finish off the inside of my card. And then all I have to do is adhere my card front to my card base. So I decided to use the Craft Tacky Glue for that as well. I go fairly light-handed with this because as most, if not all, liquid adhesives, if you use too much liquid adhesive, one, it's going to ooze out everywhere, and two, it will cause the cardstock to warp and buckle. So I use a fairly light hand. So added the adhesive, and then I'm going to adhere that to my card base, and then as a final bit of embellishment, I pulled out some of these pretty Pink Posh sea glass jewels and sprinkled those fairly liberally on my card front here. So once I was kind of happy with the placement and how many I had, I'm just going to pull out my little jewel picker tool so I can pick up the jewels, put down a dab of that Craft Tacky adhesive, and then adhere all my little jewels into place. And that's going to finish off my card. So because it's Monday, this is kind of the last day of this current color throwdown challenge. I will link to it in my blog post if anyone still wants to play along or check out what everyone else has made for it. And then there will be a new color challenge on Wednesday. I will also have links to all of the supplies I used to make this card. That'll be in the description box below the video, as well as on my blog. So thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting on my videos. I really appreciate the support, and I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye!